Video games were considered a boys' thing until Nintendo changed that and The Sims arrived. In the 70s and 80s, anything with wires or circuits was treated like a boys' hobby. Computers lived in school basements, electronics shops, and engineering clubs, places where girls were rarely encouraged to go. So when video games appeared, the industry didn't ask who else might enjoy this. They asked, how do we get boys excited about it? And the answer led straight to the arcades. Arcades weren't bright or friendly. They were loud, competitive, smoky rooms filled with flashing lights and teenage boys battling for high scores. It wasn't exactly a space where a shy girl, or any girl, felt invited. So the games matched the environment. Fast, aggressive, skill-based. Aliens, spaceships, sports, explosions. Themes the industry believed boys wanted. And when home consoles finally entered living rooms, toy companies didn't challenge these stereotypes. They reinforced them. Just like the toy aisles, blue for boys, pink for girls. Games went straight into the blue category because boys were already playing them. So marketers doubled down, assuming girls wouldn't care. Because eventually, something unexpected slipped through the cracks. Something that didn't fit the blue aisle logic at all. A game appeared that didn't try to impress boys, didn't lean on explosions or competition, and didn't pretend to be gender neutral. It looked directly at girls and said, "This one's for you." And that game was Barbie. What makes the whole story even more fascinating is that the very first Barbie game wasn't some big creative sandbox or a fashion designer simulator. It was a jump and run, simple, colorful, almost naive in how straightforward it was. But here's the important part. Even if the gameplay wasn't unusual, the target audience was. It was one of the very first games that said openly and confidently, this is for girls. Not for everyone. Not for kids. Not for families. For girls. In a time when video games were overwhelmingly coded as male, Barbie came onto the screen wrapped in pink, sparkly, soft, and completely unashamed of who it was speaking to. It didn't try to impress boys. It didn't try to fit into the arcade mindset. It simply created a space where girls could play without feeling like visitors in someone else's hobby. And to the shock of many publishers, girls responded. You know Doom, right? The groundbreaking, earth-shaking classic that redefined what games could be. Loud, fast, brutal, a cultural explosion that became the prototype for everything hardcore. And yes, back then, everyone understood this was a game made for boys. But while Doom was blasting its way into history, something completely different appeared on store shelves. A small pink CD-ROM that looked nothing like the games dominating the charts. A game about creativity, colors, clothing, imagination. Barbie Fashion Designer. Nobody expected anything from it. Publishers dismissed it. Developers joked about it. Marketing departments ignored it. And then it sold. Not just surprisingly well, but so well that it dwarfed the sales of many mainstream titles of its time, including some of the so-called giants. It didn't rely on violence, competition, or high scores. It didn't try to impress the existing gaming crowd. It simply offered an experience built for girls during an era when almost no one else was building anything for them at all. And the success was undeniable. And once Barbie had quietly proven that a different audience existed, the next shift didn't come from big cinematic titles at all. It came from something much simpler, from the casual games that lived on the Game Boy. Because while consoles were getting louder, faster, and more aggressive, handheld gaming followed its own rhythm. Tetris, for example, wasn't built around conflict or characters. It was abstract, calm, almost meditative. A game you could slip into for a few minutes. Not one that demanded your full identity as a gamer. And a lot of those early Game Boy titles had that quality. Soft colors, simple loops, no pressure, no hurry. Even Pokémon, which became a global phenomenon, was, when you strip away the brand, a slow, gentle RPG about walking through grassy fields, collecting cute creatures, and watching them grow. There was nothing aggressive about it, nothing frantic, just exploration, patience, and quiet charm. These weren't marketed as cozy games. Nobody had that word yet. But the feeling was already there. The idea that a game didn't need violence, speed, or competition to be meaningful or memorable. And it was in those quiet spaces, on train rides, in bedrooms, beneath blankets with the dim little backlight shining, that the foundation for the cozy genre was quietly forming. And looking back now, I think Nintendo understood something long before everyone else did, that girls weren't just a possible audience. They were a meaningful, reliable, and deeply loyal one. I remember noticing that even as a kid in Germany, while other companies kept pushing louder, faster games for boys, Nintendo kept sneaking in these little experiments, soft, curious titles that didn't quite fit into any genre, that somehow felt welcoming in a way most games didn't. Take Animal Crossing on the GameCube. It was strange. Honestly, it felt almost too quiet for its time. A game about talking animals, decorating a house, catching bugs, and just living. No bosses, no pressure, nothing chasing you. It felt like stepping into a warm room after being outside in the cold. Most people had no idea what to make of it. But I remember instantly feeling something familiar, a kind of gentle comfort that was so rare back then. And even before that, Nintendo had already been testing the waters. Pokémon Channel on the Nintendo 64, for example. Hardly anybody talks about it today, but it was one of those early titles that proved something important. You didn't need action to hold someone's attention. It was slow, soft, almost like a digital storybook you wandered through at your own pace. You weren't saving the world. You were just spending time with Pikachu, watching cute shows, exploring tiny spaces, and enjoying moments that didn't demand anything from you. As a girl, it felt almost rebellious in its softness, like Nintendo was whispering to us, "It's okay. Games don't always have to be battles. They can simply be yours." And I think that was the moment, long before cozy games had a name, that many of us realized what kind of worlds we actually loved. Not the ones shouting for attention, but the ones warm enough to make you want to stay. It's about worlds and about the relationships inside them. Because in the end, that's what these games were really offering. Not high scores, not explosions, not the thrill of beating someone else. They were offering worlds. Worlds that felt safe to enter. Worlds that didn't rush you. Worlds that let you exhale a little after a long day. But even more than that, they offered relationships. Not the kind built on combat or competition, but the quiet, gentle kind. The ones that grow slowly. The ones you nurture. The ones that make you feel connected, even when you're alone. When I think about those early Nintendo experiments, Animal Crossing, Pokémon Channel, even the softer side of classic Pokémon, they all understood something that most of the industry missed. Girls weren't looking for power fantasies. They were looking for connections. Connections to characters, to creatures, to little digital communities that felt more alive than the real world sometimes did. And there was something incredibly healing about that, especially for a girl who didn't always feel represented in gaming. These games weren't shouting for attention. They were offering companionship. A villager remembering your birthday. A Pokémon leaning its head to the side, waiting for your reaction. A small town that stayed exactly as you left it. Patient, gentle, waiting for you to return. They were worlds where relationships mattered more than reflexes. Where kindness was a valid playstyle. Where taking your time wasn't punished, but rewarded. What made The Sims a true cultural turning point wasn't its charm or its humor. And it wasn't because it stood in contrast to the loud, action-driven games that dominated the industry. It became a turning point because it completely rewrote the relationship between the player and the game itself, asking a question that no major title had ever dared to focus on before. Not how fast are you, not how strong are you, not how many enemies can you defeat before the screen fades to red, but something far more intimate and strangely powerful. What kind of life do you want to build? And who do you want to become inside it? Before The Sims, Almost every game centered on performance, reflexes, mastery, the constant pressure to overcome challenges as efficiently as possible. Success was defined through reaction time, precision, endurance, and the entire medium was built around proving yourself again and again. Then, almost overnight, The Sims shifted the ground beneath the entire landscape by presenting a world in which the traditional concept of winning didn't even exist. There was no final boss, no climactic battle, no linear path to glory, only choices, possibilities, and consequences that unfolded like tiny social experiments. What made this so revolutionary was that it allowed players to engage with something games had always treated as secondary or irrelevant: the emotional architecture of everyday life. Suddenly, the things that had once been considered background noise, friendships, arguments, routines, ambitions, jealousy, comfort, identity, became the very systems the game revolved around. Your time wasn't spent surviving danger, but shaping a home, navigating a relationship, building a career, and watching your characters evolve in ways that felt strangely human. And this shift spoke to an audience that had never been invited into gaming on their own terms. For girls and women especially, it offered a kind of agency that didn't hinge on combat or dominance, but on understanding people, managing emotions, shaping environments, and exploring who you are when the world allows you to make quiet decisions instead of dramatic ones. It wasn't cozy in the modern sense. It was sharper, funnier, occasionally chaotic, but it made room for a kind of play that had very little to do with aggression and everything to do with observation, intention, and empathy. The Sims didn't simply open a door to new genres, it revealed that entire groups of players had been standing outside that door for years, waiting for a game that reflected the kinds of stories and connections they actually cared about. And once that realization entered the industry, once developers understood how deeply players connected to emotional gameplay, there was no turning back. The idea of what games could be and who they could be for expanded forever. When the Nintendo DS arrived, it didn't look like a revolution. It looked like a toy, a clamshell with two tiny screens and a stylus that felt almost fragile in your hand. And yet, without any grand announcement, the DS became one of the most important turning points in gaming culture, especially for girls who had never truly seen themselves reflected in the medium before. I remember the moment vividly, the way the DS fit into the palm of your hand, how it felt more like something you carried with you than something you sat down to play seriously. It wasn't intimidating. It didn't ask you to master complex controls. It simply opened up like a tiny book, invited you inside, and whispered, "What would you like to do today?" And then came Nintendogs. If The Sims redefined what a game could be emotionally, Nintendogs redefined what a game could be personally. It didn't ask you to save a kingdom or defeat an enemy. It asked you to care, to feed a puppy, teach it tricks, speak its name into the microphone, and build a small relationship that felt surprisingly real in a quiet, private way only handheld gaming can achieve. For an entire generation of girls, myself included, Nintendogs wasn't just a game you played. It was a companion you carried from room to room, from the living room sofa to the kitchen table, from long car rides to the quiet moments before bed. It slipped into your school bag, your jacket pocket, your everyday life. It made gaming feel close, intimate, almost domestic, something you tended to, like a plant or a diary. It was the first time many girls felt that a game wasn't observing them from afar, but meeting them at eye level, not demanding skill, not asking for performance, but offering a bond, a small living creature inside that double screen that responded to your voice, your touch, your attention. And the shockwave was enormous. Nintendogs didn't become a hit because it was simple. It became a hit because it made space for a completely different style of play, a style that felt natural to millions of girls who had never connected with the competitive, hyperactive landscape the rest of the industry was chasing. And suddenly, bedrooms around the world changed. Instead of secretive PC corners or living room battles over the controller, there were DS systems glowing under blankets, soft barks coming from tiny speakers, children waking up early to feed their digital puppies as if they were real. The DS made gaming feel private. Nintendogs made gaming feel personal. And together, they quietly pulled the industry toward something it had never bothered to imagine before. A world where play could be tender, where imagination didn't need adrenaline, and where girls weren't just a footnote. They were the audience shaping the next decade. When you look back at the DS era, the soft interactions, the personal, almost private way people played, you can see the cozy genre taking shape long before the word cozy existed. But handheld gaming wasn't building this movement alone. Something else had been quietly preparing the ground for years. Harvest Moon, long before Nintendogs taught players to care, and long before Animal Crossing made daily rituals feel like gameplay, Harvest Moon was already experimenting with a completely different rhythm of play. A rhythm built not on conflict, but on routine, responsibility, and the slow satisfaction of watching something grow because of your care. And even though it wasn't marketed as a girls' game, a lot of girls found it and held on to it because it gave them something no other game at the time offered: a world where relationships, seasons, chores, and quiet progress mattered more than defeating enemies or mastering reflexes. Farming by daylight, talking to villagers at dusk, building a life that didn't rely on adrenaline. All of this became a blueprint for what cozy games would later perfect. So when the Nintendo DS arrived, it didn't create cozy gaming from scratch. It amplified something Harvest Moon had already proven years earlier: that players, especially girls and women, weren't looking for constant intensity. They were looking for continuity, for a world they could tend to day after day, where progress wasn't explosive but earned quietly. And that's why the DS generation hit with such force. Nintendogs brought emotional immediacy. Animal Crossing, Wild World brought daily life and community. Puzzle games brought calm focus. And Harvest Moon's legacy, this idea that a game could feel like a life instead of a challenge, finally found the mainstream recognition it deserved. Together, these experiences created a new kind of player identity. Not the hardcore gamer the industry kept chasing, but the player who valued ritual, care, creativity, and the slow unfolding of a world that felt alive. From that mixture, the handheld intimacy of the DS, the emotional grounding of Nintendogs, the social ritual of Animal Crossing, and the life simulation heart of Harvest Moon, the modern cozy genre wasn't just born. It became inevitable. And then came the Wii, a white, quiet little console that didn't look powerful, didn't look aggressive, and didn't try to compete with the cinematic ambition of the PlayStation 3 or the raw hardware flex of the Xbox 360. It did something far simpler and far more radical. It made gaming approachable. For the first time in gaming history, the living room wasn't divided into people who played games and people who watched someone else play games. The Wii blurred that line completely. Mothers, fathers, daughters, grandparents, older sisters, younger cousins, everyone picked up that remote-shaped controller because it didn't look like a controller at all. It looked like an invitation. You didn't need thumb precision. You didn't need perfect reflexes. You didn't need to be a gamer. You just swung your arm, laughed when you missed the ball in Wii Sports, and tried again. And that changed something deep, not just in homes, but in the way the industry understood who games were for. Because suddenly, the biggest gaming audience in the world wasn't teenage boys shouting about kill streaks. It was families. It was women. It was players who wanted experiences that felt warm, playful, and social. Games like Wii Sports, Wii Fit, Cooking Mama, My Sims, Endless Ocean, Animal Crossing City Folk. They didn't ask for mastery. They asked for movement, curiosity, and connection. They turned gaming from a performance into a shared moment. I still remember seeing my own family react to it. People who never touched a controller in their lives, suddenly laughing, swinging, balancing, cheering. Gaming didn't feel like a private hobby anymore. It felt like a gathering. And that mainstream acceptance, that idea that games could be gentle, that they could be slow, that they could be about cooking, fishing, breathing, moving your body, or simply existing in a world without danger, created the cultural soil in which modern cozy gaming could finally grow openly. What handheld consoles had started quietly, the Wii amplified into the loudest message the industry had heard in years. Comfort wasn't a niche. It was a market, a massive one. And from that moment on, cozy wasn't an accident anymore. It was a direction, a path the industry could finally see clearly. And while Nintendo helped soften the edges of gaming, the true home of cozy games was never a console living room at all. It was the PC, that quiet corner of the digital world where small studios could experiment, where indie games could breathe, and where players could build entire lives inside simulations without needing a blockbuster budget or a marketing campaign. On PC, cozy games didn't have to fight for attention next to shooters and action titles. They could grow naturally, supported by players who wanted depth, creativity, and the freedom to shape worlds at their own pace. Games like The Sims, Stardew Valley, Don't Starve, My Time at Portia, and countless tiny indie titles found an audience not because they were loud, but because the PC gave them room to exist. And then something happened that changed everything about how cozy games spread. Streaming. Platforms like Twitch and later YouTube didn't just give these games visibility, they gave them personality. Suddenly, you weren't just watching gameplay, you were watching someone's routine, their digital home, their farm, their village. Their tiny rituals that played out like comfort television. Cozy games were perfect for this. They weren't about winning, they were about being, and that made them incredibly watchable. Streamers didn't need dramatic reactions. They didn't need high-level skill. All they had to do was play slowly, talk softly, decorate a house, harvest a field, pet a digital animal, and an entire community would show up just to feel that calm with them. And because so many of those early streamers were women, something powerful happened. Cozy gaming became not just a genre, but a culture, a shared emotional space where people gathered to relax, to connect, to slow down together. The PC gave cozy games a home, streaming gave them a voice. And the combination turned a quiet niche into one of the most loved movements in modern gaming. And that's exactly the world that modern cozy games were born into. By the time Stardew Valley appeared, the language was already there, even as many of us didn't have a word for it yet. Here was a game that took the emotional DNA of Harvest Moon, mixed it with the freedom of PC mod culture, and wrapped it in a story about burnout, escape, and starting over somewhere quiet. It wasn't just about farming, it was about feeling. I make videos for people who care about comfort, nostalgia, and the quieter corners of gaming culture, the places where we can breathe a little. So if that sounds like home to you, consider subscribing and staying for the next chapter. Thanks for being here.